Now the next item on our checklist is a little trickier still, because here we are talking about objects that no longer follow the rules of matte rendering. We are talking about objects that have reflective surfaces. And as you can see here from our 3D examples, just simply making the ball chrome makes a world of a difference. All of a sudden it is a mirror instead of a surface that we render the way we're used to. Even when you take it outside and have a only slightly reflective material, you can still see there's a really big difference. Here we're getting all the clouds and the ground surface reflected back into the sphere. So when I explain how some of this stuff works, know that this is tricky. You are not going to be painting photorealistic reflections in the immediate future. But hopefully just kind of breaking down how that works will help you start this process. It's also something that we're just going to fake a little in our illustrations, but if you want to get really hyper specific with it, I definitely recommend a class on schoolism.com led by Scott Robertson. Very good stuff. So anyway, what we are talking about are objects that have the sort of diffuse colors underneath, whatever that might be, and then on top have a layer that acts like a mirror. And since our life does not often come in contact with chrome spheres, let's take a look at a more obvious example. Something like this countertop here. So you can clearly see it's marble, and the surface is polished down to a mirror-like finish. So you get two different things happening. You can see that there is an overlay of reflected environment. You can see the window and the faucet and the coffee maker, all these different things. But you can also still see the sort of natural local value of the marble. You're getting both at the same time. And because this is totally flat and has a very, very perfect finish, you're getting a very crisp, clean reflection. Then you have something like this Beetle Skin where you're still getting a very sharp reflection. Here it's probably an overcast sky, but the surface itself is not mirror smooth like the marble. Instead, the surface has all these little bumps and craters. So what you're getting is not matte rendering like we're used to. Instead, you're getting a very clear reflection of the sky, but it's being disrupted by the sort of surface topography. So the finish itself you can think of as a separate layer. You have the material underneath and then the shininess laying on top. And how perfect that shininess is going to tell you how you want to approach the rendering. Like this floor, for example, it's a little bit scuffed up. It's been worn a bit, so the reflection is not crystal clear. It's no longer a mirror. It's more of a sort of diffused, blurred reflection. Also notice that because there's gaps between the floorboards, you see that in the reflection. So you have reflection then broken up by these sort of seam lines between the individual boards. This wood is even older still, so what you get is a little bit of reflectance, but it's very dull. So in a lot of ways, the underlying layer between these two examples is pretty much the same. It's relatively flat boards with gaps between the panels. But the difference is the quality of that gloss coat on top. And clearly the result is that one has a clear finish and one has a much more diffused, disrupted reflectance. And this is almost a lineup of what different results you can get. All these bowling balls are obviously in the same exact environment. There's one type of light that's reflecting in all of them, and yet that highlight just looks different. Some of them have a much more blurred out glossy reflection, some have a sharper one, and it all has to do with that top layer of the material, the sort of glossy coat that's sitting on top of the color and the local value. So when it comes to glossy objects, there's a lot more variation than we have with matte surface objects. Because even matte surface, something like sand, gets wet and then it becomes a reflective object. Because when you look at the color variation here as it approaches the water, that's actually just the reflection of the clouds above. So in a sense, this is exactly like our marble countertop. What you're getting is a little bit disrupted, but it's still a mirror surface. And in this case, it is reflecting the sky above. I think another really visible example for this idea is a skyscraper. Because here with the skyscraper, you have two surfaces primarily. You have a more matte finish, which would be the building bricks, and then you have the windows, which are very glossy. And so here you've got two lighting zones. The top of the building is illuminated, the bottom of the building is in shadow. And you can tell very obviously with the matte surface, it is light value at the top and dark value at the bottom. But these windows are sort of a different story. Even where it's at this threshold between light and dark, illuminated and shadow, the windows essentially look the same. And this proves that glossy objects are really showing you more reflected environment than they are showing you a matte surface. And so as a result, they're really not affected by direct light in the way that we've been used to. Instead, they're more mirror than they are object. Here's another great example. You can see a very clear cast shadow, probably from another building, and the windows are essentially unaffected. So this is one of those subjects that you could talk about for hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to try and keep it brief and break this down into some rules of thumb. First, we could talk about how reflective is your surface. So if we were looking at a gradation here, on one end of the spectrum would be chrome, which would be a total mirror and would not have any influence from that matte rendering. At the other end, we'd have a complete matte rendering with no surface that's reflective. And most things that you paint are going to not be at either end of the spectrum. They're going to be somewhere in the middle and are going to both exhibit a terminator and the normal hallmarks that we see from matte rendering objects, but they're also going to have a little bit of reflectance overlaid. The next thing you might want to break down in your general rules of thumb would be what is the quality of the reflection. On one end, you would have perfect clear mirror, like the marble countertop. And then on the right, you would have a totally blurred out, scuffed up reflection that's been walked on for years and years. Another thing worth looking at is the way that a reflective surface is going to distort the environment. And this is where things start to get really tricky if you want to be super accurate. But here I just have some basic primitive shapes that show some sort of standard results. Cylinders are something you're going to be encountering a lot, whether it's pipes or tubes. These turn the environment into nice stripes. So it has a very linear quality of compressing that environment down and wrapping it around the cylinder. Spheres are a little harder to envision. They have a sort of complicated way of distorting the environment, but it's good to just look at reference if you want to fake this. Any object that has individual planes and hard angles between them, the important thing to notice is that you're going to have the reflection shift as it crosses these edges. Unlike a sphere where there's one continuous distortion, you can think of each of these faces as sort of individual mirrors, and each one is going to have a different reflection. But seeing all this chrome just makes it a little more complicated than it really needs to be, is the truth of it. Because when we look at this wine bottle, I think this really says it all. If you zoom way in and blow out the contrast, you can tell there is an entire environment being reflected. But at a quick read, all you really see is the sky. And the reason for this is there's a huge dynamic range difference between the brightness of the sky versus the sort of contrast within these houses. The sky is just way, way brighter. So in a dark glass like this, all you're really going to see is the sky. And then you can sort of do subtle hinting at the rest of the environment. And when it goes for things inside of a photo studio, you have even less detail. Here, all you're seeing are very intentionally placed light elements that just give neat sort of graphic shapes for the reflection. So when you are illustrating your own glossy objects, a sort of safe way to fake it is to just include the light source. Also, it can be nice to include the ground surface, but you don't need to show every tiny little detail of the reflected environment. Now, if you're dealing with chrome, well, then yes, you would have to show everything. But most materials only have enough reflective influence that you're just going to see the really brightest things in the environment. Now, the final thing I want to talk about with reflective objects is the idea of angle of incidence. Now, not all surfaces are going to be affected by this to the same degree. For instance, when you look at chrome, it is reflective equally from any angle. But a lot of glossy objects are actually not equally reflective depending on how you look at them. A great example is if you look at a lake. If you look way off into the distance, you'll see the sky reflected into the horizon. But then if you look down at your feet, you can see straight through that water. Now the water is the same. Far away or near you, it is just water. But the difference is the angle that you are looking at the surface. Another great example is car paint. If you look at part of a car that's directly in front of you, you see more of the sort of color of the paint. In this case, it's red paint and you're seeing red. But then if you look at the far away edge of the paint, you're looking at this at a steeper angle, and you can see that it's picking up a lot more of that reflected environment. This is another great example. This is a museum here in Seattle, and what you're looking at is sort of a local color and value of brass, but these surfaces that are pointing more up at the sky are reflecting the sky. So this is going to change depending on the angle that you look at it. But a great way to simplify this idea is just as surfaces turn away from you in space, they are going to be more reflective. And it all has to do with that angle that you're seeing it at. So as you can see, glossy objects are a challenge. But let's just do some studies and maybe you can start to see how this works in practice. I really liked the metal in that Frank Gehry building that had that kind of neat plating effect. So I'm going to try and do a study of that. And it's got two different things going for it. It starts with a matte surface rendering, and that's what we are used to doing. So for this, I'm going to start in the exact same way. I'll give myself the panel lines, and then I will paint the sort of different local values underneath, put in some seam borders and rivets, and add a few drips. And that gets us up to the finished matte surface rendering. If this was totally non-reflective, this is where we would end. But it's not. This is a reflective surface, but only reflective at a steep angle. So I'm going to make a new layer here and just paint a reflection of the entire environment. Now, you would not necessarily need to be this detailed if you knew you were not drawing a mirror ball, but for the sake of example, I just want to show how you can walk through this one step at a time. So first off, I'm going to put this underneath the panel borders. Next, I want to consider the quality of the reflection. Based on the reference, it's not really a mirror finish. So I'm just going to take that nice mirror chrome that I rendered and blur it. Simple as that. But once I've done that, the question becomes how much reflection do I want to include versus how much of the underlying surface do I want to show? And since this is Photoshop, I love using layer masks for this. Here I can paint with black and white, and I can sort of blend back and forth, revealing and hiding various layers. But the knowledge that's guiding all this is that it's going to be the most reflective around the edges of the sphere, because that's where I'm seeing it at a steeper angle. In the center of the sphere, it's going to show more of that initial matte finish rendering. So now that we've broken it down into those two parts, we've got our reflected environment, nice looking chrome. Let's take our old rock and make it wet. And when things are wet at a steep angle, they become reflective. They also become a little darker and a little higher contrast. So considering things in a modular sense, here I'm just going to take that same chrome ball and put it underneath my surface layer. So it's underneath the cracks and crevices, but it is now completely mirrored. And this is not really the look I want. But all I need to do is consider how prevalent do I want the reflection versus how prevalent do I want the underlying matte surface information. And this is really where you want to look at reference. Photos are a great way to see how things work in the real world. And just like before, this is going to be shinier as the form rolls away from me in space, and less shiny as it's looking directly at me. So to accomplish that, I'm going to use a mask and sort of hide away the reflective layer in the center of the sphere and have it be more prevalent around the edges. Then I'll do a little quick levels overlay and it looks pretty good. All right, and with this final example here, I want to show what two different surface materials on one object would look like. So here I'm going to do some sort of sci-fi panel borders, and then that center one I want to be a dark stripe. Again, I'm going to use photo reference for this, but essentially I'm creating a mirror plastic, maybe an acrylic, and so it's going to be very dark, but it's still going to have a little bit of that reflection in it, and then a very visible sun reflected. Because like when we think about the wine bottle, you have sort of a low contrast environment being reflected in the surface, but a very prevalent light source. And that's a quick way to make glossy surfaces read as realistic. Now I want the rest of it to have almost like a velvet finish. So it's still going to have reflections, but the reflections are going to be very blurred. And with this in mind, I'm going to show how I'd approach it without actually painting that whole chrome sphere, because you don't really need to do that every time. So if we remember, in the chrome sphere, we had light value on the bottom and then dark value from the sky on the top. And because of the angle of incidence, this is only going to be visible around the edges and not in the center. So what I'm going to do is just paint with the airbrush those values in the right spots. So here I'm sort of skipping that preliminary step of painting chrome and then blurring it. Instead, I'm just sort of painting airbrush in the first place because I know what that end result is supposed to look like. And the final step is really just adding polish. So I'm going to make those seam borders pop a little bit and then scuff up that acrylic right around that glossy reflection. Because again, this is out in the desert, it can't look too perfect. So some dust and scratches will just make it look a little nicer. But the reason I wanted to include this one is to show a more realistic workflow, which is to say I understand the idea of it being a chrome sphere, but that doesn't mean that I have to paint the chrome sphere. These materials read realistically enough, and yet I took some shortcuts. And that's really what illustration is all about. You use reference, you have knowledge, and you understand how it works in sort of a perfect scenario. But then, just for efficiency's sake, you paint in a more simplified way. So in this case, using an airbrush for me was a quick way to get that sort of reflected value in there, but to not be too particular about it. And with more experience, you're going to be able to take those same shortcuts.